Monster Hunter Wilds is hitting absolutely insane concurrent player numbers on PC, peaking at almost 1.4 million concurrent players. That's all playing at the same time. So sales are going to be many times higher than that. Capcom has made an absolute insane amount of money on the PC version of the game, which is gonna factor into why I'm so frustrated with the PC version of the game. And I'm not alone. If we go to Steam and scroll through here, you'll see a lot of thumbs downs on the reviews. We're seeing overall mixed. 54% of the 36,000 reviews so far are positive. These are user reviews. And again, the vast majority of the thumbs downs are saying that the game itself is fine or even great, but that the PC performance optimizations are awful. If I just randomly stop here, horribly unoptimized, unintuitive menu systems, 3 different friends list, etc. So just some issues with a variety of things, but again, starting with unoptimized. Anyway, again, not recommended number 1 thing, performance and fidelity. So yeah, there's a lot of frustration here. Is there anything to it? And does Capcom have anything to say? Well, Capcom has responded. So here is Capcom's first response to the criticisms of the PC performance. They say, Hunters, if you're experiencing any initial issues with Monster Hunter Wilds on Steam, please try updating your graphics driver, turning off compatibility mode, and then readjust your settings. Thank you for all your patience and support. That's it. That's seriously it. Now, if you're like, ooh, what are these more details? Not useful. It's just, again, basic troubleshooting things to make sure you're like installed correctly on your PC. In other words, it feels like they're trying to gaslight people into thinking that if you're having performance problems, it's a you problem, you didn't do something right. But that is simply not the case. So we also, like it's possible to run the game on a high-end system and not have too bad of a performance. For example, here's running the benchmark tool on my 5070 Ti and 9800X3D at maximum 1440p settings. So 1440p, no upscaling, that's why it says custom. This is the ultra settings, but I turned off upscaling. It defaults to using upscaling no matter what. I've also turned off frame gen with this game really, really, really wants you to turn on frame gen. It's a little bit distressing that when it not only initially pops that up as the first thing you see when you start the game, but then also if you say no, it's like, really, are you sure? You can turn it on later. Don't forget, you can turn on frame gen, guys. No, it's not that I hate frame gen or anything. I think if you have a high enough base frame rate, it can be fine. But according to their own system requirements, how they recommend you to play the game, they're recommending that you're using frame generation to hit 60 frames per second. Now that means that the rendered frames are only running at 30 frames per second in order to hit that 60. And that doesn't look good or feel good. AMD, for example, specifically recommends you have at least 60 FPS before enabling frame gen. NVIDIA is a little more cagey on what exact base frame rate they recommend, but if you talk to them about latency numbers and things like that, they're certainly not recommending a 30 to 60 FPS frame gen mode as ideal. This is not what frame gen does. Frame generation is a win more feature. It's best when you're already getting a good frame rate to then take advantage of a high refresh rate display. Frame generation is not performance, it's interpolation. It takes 2 frames that already exist and guesses what happened in between, so your monitor displays more images and there's a higher perception of motion fluidity. But the wider the gap between the 2 frames are, the worse its guess is going to be, so it looks worse, and also it doesn't increase performance. In fact, it has to buffer a frame in order to allow it to do the interpolation, so it delays responsiveness. Now, if you're running at a high enough frame rate, those issues become pretty minor, and the increased motion fluidity is generally worth it. But it is simply unacceptable to say that you should be achieving 60 frames per second after enabling frame generation as the recommended way to play the game. It's quite frankly ridiculous that that's their recommended way to play. Also, keep in mind, that's already for an upscaled 1080p, so you're not actually even at 1080p, you're on the medium graphics setting preset, which I want to show you what that actually is. The medium graphics setting preset, which is what the mid-range system I threw together to test things out in, defaulted to, is literally enabling DLSS performance mode on a 1080p display. That means it's rendering at 540p internally and then upscaling that to a 1080p output. And despite that, it's still falling well below 60 frames per second if you don't use frame generation. Oh, and cards like the 3060 don't support NVIDIA's frame generation, so you'd have to use FSR version of frame gen if you were going to use frame gen at all, which means you would then be using FSR upscaling, which doesn't look anywhere near as good, especially when trying to come from 540p on a 1080p display. Here's what this looks like in actual motion with the game running. It's quite blurry, and again, my other issue is not that the game looks awful, but that it doesn't look particularly visually striking. It has a very washed out look, and there's really not anything just out of the ordinary impressive given this level of performance. So this is very frustrating. Again, you can try to power through this with an extremely high-end system. Here's the same scene running on my 5070 Ti, a 9800X 3D based system, which is a multiple thousands of dollar PC at current pricing. 5070 Ti's are mostly over $1,000 right now, 9800X 3D somewhere around a 500 or so, plus you have to build the rest of the system. So this is probably at least $2,000 plus system. And sure, you're able to achieve usually over 60 FPS at max settings at 1440p. But these max settings at 1440p, again, I would argue, given that we're still dipping below 60 FPS at times, are not at all, justifying the performance hit that you're getting. Because if you were running like a full path tracing mode, something like RT Overdrive in Cyberpunk or something like that, maybe I understand this level of performance. But a lot of this is just not that visually striking considering the performance that you're getting. What is the GPU doing here? Now, I'll be honest, I have had way less time than I would like to explore the full release version of the game because I'm one person and I am in the middle of working on graphics cards reviews because that is my main content. We've got the 5070, the 9070, and 9070 XT all launching in just a few days, and that means I've got a lot of benchmarking. However, I was curious what other people are saying about this. Digital Foundry absolutely knows what they're doing when they're investigating PC performance. So what did they think about it? Because sometimes when you get all these users complaining, it's just like, okay, you're trying to use ultra settings on a GPU that just doesn't have enough VRAM, stop whining, or something like that. In this case, it absolutely seems justified. So it looks like in Digital Foundry's testing, if you try to boot up the game on an RTX 4060 paired with a 9800X 3D to eliminate people saying that it's just a CPU issue. If you're getting bad performance, it's just your CPU. This game is very heavy on the CPU, but it's also extremely heavy on the GPU, unreasonably so. He's showing massive repeatable frame time spikes throughout the initial run here on the RTX 4060 as the game defaulted to play, which is DLSS balanced at high preset with ray tracing off. And this is turning down to medium textures to try to avoid VRAM issues. He was already having even more issues when he initially started on the high textures, which is what it actually defaulted to. And then he calls into question that the game never actually warns you that you're over your VRAM capacity when you actually are. Also, the question is like, what is all of this performance going to when you look at things like incredibly blurry textures that don't look quite right? Looking at textures like this that seem to be decompressing improperly. This is supposed to be white. It's clearly not. And then just in general, looking at scenes where you're just, for the most part, staring at sand with a little bit of water, and yet overall performance is not great. What is the performance going for? And there's still these big frame time spikes. Again, that's on the high settings, but dropping down to medium textures, helps, but still doesn't completely solve all problems. So in the end, this is one of the most aggressive headlines I've ever seen from a Digital Foundry PC review. Monster Hunter Wilds PC, profound performance problems must be addressed. So, profound performance problems must be addressed. What is Capcom's response? Have you checked updating your drivers? Try turning off compatibility mode and then readjust your settings. This is unacceptable. This is an unacceptable response from Capcom. They should own the fact that PC optimization is not great. And the fact that they have this many players on PC, because keep in mind, over 1 million concurrent players. That's players signed in and playing the game all at the same time. The actual sales numbers are probably orders of magnitude above this. I've seen various people suggest different figures for how to estimate off of the peak concurrent players at launch to the actual sales figures. I've seen numbers saying that multiplying by anything from 10 to 30 is actually reasonable, forgetting what the actual sales figures are versus the peak concurrent players. Obviously, that's a pretty big range, but it's safe to say that Capcom has made a staggering amount of money off of the launch of this game on PC, and will probably continue to get more as more and more people keep buying the game. So this level of performance is completely unacceptable, and I would like a much stronger response from them regarding a promise of continued patching. Because first of all, I also want to say, I don't like the trend of launching a game in a state of poor optimization and then fixing it later. However, if you've already launched a game in a state of poor optimization, I would at least like some assurances that this problem is going to be worked on. The problem is, I'm wondering how much they can do, because we've seen other games like Dragon's Dogma 2 using the same engine for an open world game really struggling. However, I hope they can do something, because a lot of this just looks bad. If you want more in-depth testing analysis, I highly recommend this Digital Foundry video where I mentioned a few of the things he noticed. But again, watch the whole video if you want a further analysis. I wish I had more time to dig into some further testing of my own. But like I said, I've got to get my head back into the GPU benchmarking game because I've got a lot of work to do, guys. But this is the state of Monster Hunter Wilds at release. It's not great. And I also, last thought, do not like that their benchmark tool is gaslighting you about the performance, because they'll spit out some number that's way higher than what you should actually expect if 2/3 of the thing isn't just cutscenes. Because they insert these cutscenes that run ridiculously higher frame rate than anything you're getting in actual gameplay. So in actual gameplay, performance numbers are way lower than what this benchmark spits out, because it spends a huge chunk of the benchmark run showing cutscenes, where it's not so relevant what your performance is in a cutscene. Matters what your performance is while you're playing the game. Now, I'm happy a lot of people seem to be enjoying the game, and there's tons of sales here. I just, it would be nice if maybe they take some of this money and use it to fund an extreme level of optimization work on this game on PC, because it's frankly unacceptable given the visuals that we're seeing. It's one thing if a game is difficult to run because it pushed incredible boundaries visually. This didn't do that. It looks at best okay, but the performance certainly isn't. Hope all of you still manage to have an excellent day, though.